Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to this special briefing for Members of Parliament, which is part of a series of virtual briefings with the support of Wilderness Foundation Africa and ICCF. As always, a special welcome to the honourable members and a big thank you to the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, the Honourable Pasa, for hosting this briefing. Welcome also to everyone joining us via YouTube. Now, as we all know, the COVID pandemic has posed enormous challenges on all parts of society, and particularly on the economic front. Protected areas have been no exception. And given the dire financial situation these protected areas are facing, Minister Creasy recently announced additional funding in excess of R1 billion to assist. The question remains, however, how do we fund these areas in future? And this is the question we are asking today. We have two experts in this field who will give a short input each of 10 to 15 minutes, after which we will give the MPs the opportunity to ask questions. I also just want to mention that we were hoping to have someone from the South African National Parks with us, but there was some difficulty in getting the necessary permission for him to be part of this discussion. So our first speaker today is Dr. Dave Balfour. Dave has over 25 years of experience in protected area management in South Africa. He started as a park ecologist and ended up on the executive of the Eastern Cape Parks Board, a position he held for 5 years. Dave has overseen the development of over 20 protected area management plans and has detailed knowledge of protected area management, governance and planning, and the financial challenges that all state-owned protected areas in South Africa face. More recently, as a consultant, he has supported the government with the development and revision of the National Protected Area Expansion Strategy. Dave, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and good day to all honourable members. I hope I'm observing all protocol. I have a few slides that I'm going to be showing you just because of that. I find it easier that way, so forgive me while I set it up. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Melanie, can you tell me when you see it coming through? I have initiated the sharing screen. Yeah, okay, great. So, sorry. What I want to be talking to you today is about the big picture of protected area financing in South Africa. And it's going to have a very strong focus on the state protected areas. Colin will be talking after me and his focus will be more on the private. But I will cross those boundaries a little bit because they are integrally involved with each other. So if we first take a look at the national situation, and I want you to talk about how over the last 60 to 90 years, things have changed in the country. I think it's a really important background to understanding our immediate set of crises. So if you look at the left-hand graph, the state protected areas are the ones in blue, and you can see how very steadily over time, from the 1910s, current day, South Africa has gained from 0, essentially, to 400 state protected areas. And these figures are all rough, they're not rounded, they're not detailed. But the importance of private protected areas is also there, and that's why Colin will be talking. And I just make that point now with over 800 of these private protected areas. If you look at the extent, the area of land under these protected areas, on the right-hand graph, you see it comes out at roughly equal. So they work in tandem in the country. They are equally important. If you look at the financing now of state protected areas, and I take you back to 1960, I'll pick up on this point in my closing slide as well. From the 1960s, in real dollar terms, you can see the blue lines demonstrate state financing of protected areas. And gradually over the decades, up until the 1990s, state financing for protected areas increased. In the orange lines, what you see is how tourism contributing to both state and private protected areas started increasing over time. But for a large part of the latter years of the 20th century, there's no doubt that the state financing was more important than tourism was. At the dawn of democracy, however, and the government was now needing to reallocate resources, a whole lot of new imperatives for financing, real effective financing for state protected areas from the state started declining. The tourism component, however, continued to increase, and we became more and more reliant as a country on this one single source of financing for protected areas. I'm not a complete wizard on these graphs, so 2019 and 2020 should be much closer together on the graph. But you can see how with the COVID pandemic, there's been this dramatic drop in the amount of finance coming in from tourism. And this is the crisis we face today. I've put some question marks in there because the truth is we don't yet know the full magnitude of that decline in financing. And that's what we're talking about now. A recent Al Jazeera clip, however, suggests that somewhere in the region of 85% of conservation in South Africa was funded by tourism at the beginning of the year before COVID kicked in. It's a dramatic drop that we're seeing. If I take you quickly to 3 case studies, first of all, national parks, the kind of numbers we're talking about, a total income of 3 billion a year for National Parks Board. These are very rounded off figures, don't hold me to the detail. Of that, the state grant, roughly 0.7 billion. Own revenue, largely, but not only through tourism, 2.3 billion. Of that, in the last financial report that is available publicly, the operational expenditure was 2.6 billion, giving South African national parks roughly 400 million excess for that year in that financial report. So on the face of it, a really good story, but very clear reliance on tourism as a major, major funder. The equivalent figures for KZN Wildlife, which is one of the provincial protected areas, the largest provincial protected area agency, the total income of roughly just over 1 billion, own revenue from tourism made up somewhere around about 90% of that, very, very reliant on tourism. And despite that, they ended up with a 50 million rand deficit. Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism Agency, they're a much smaller, newer conservation board. You will see that their figures are smaller yet again, 260 million total income, of which 240 million was from the state. So they have a very different situation where they're still building their tourism product. They haven't yet invested enormous infrastructure in tourism, and this might be a fantastic opportunity for them to review their approach to future financing, particularly in light of, if you look at these figures on the right here, where of the 20 million own revenue that they made, roughly 6 million was from tourism and 12 million came from wildlife sales. So even where they made their own revenue, the bulk of it wasn't from tourism. So going forward, understanding these nuances are very important for the decisions that agencies make in terms of their financing strategies. I think it's also important to note that each of these agencies has different mandates covering different extents. Sandparks is only within protected areas, as Imvelo is within protected areas and beyond. The Eastern Cape Parks Board, again, is only within protected areas. So that's an important consideration. In addition to all of that, I think when understanding the financing of protected areas, it's important to realize that the figures presented don't include one-off grants for capital investment. and understanding these figures over, say, a 10-year period are really important for understanding the overall sustainability of financing into protected areas. Also, it's important to understand the detail within some of those graphs that I showed you. For example, the first graph you saw showed approximately 400 state-owned and managed protected areas. 19 of those are national parks. It's now 20, but at the time it was 19. And only 5 of those are nominally profitable. So just because you're a national park doesn't mean you're able to make profit from tourism. It's also important to understand that in many instances, where those parks are not profitable from tourism, it is entirely possible that the financing from state or the cross-subsidization from other parks ends up paying for tourism within a park. And so some of the expenditure may be sunk into tourism that's not profitable. And this, of course, is a very key concern going forward. It's really hard to tease that out at the moment because the true figures are not explained in the accountancy that agencies currently conduct. So understanding expenditure and income for conservation versus tourism as separate entities is currently a very difficult accounting puzzle to tease out. So having said that at the local level, I just quickly want to take you a step back into the global view. While we're worrying about this very specific crisis of funding protected areas in South Africa, part of the question is, well, does it matter? And what's the context? How should we understand this in the bigger picture? So the first point to make here is that the UN Convention on Biodiversity has currently got a target of expanding protected areas to somewhere around 17% of the land area. South Africa at the moment, if it was to achieve those targets, would have to add 140,000 square kilometers and 105,000 square kilometers of marine. 140,000 square kilometers of terrestrial protected areas and 105,000 square kilometers of marine protected areas to achieve those targets. So we currently fall short of them. And the important point to take home here is that globally, the significance and value of protected areas is increasing, and we're currently falling short. So the pressure is to expand our protected area state, not to shrink it in light of the current financing challenges. It's not only is it bigger than we currently are able to meet, we anticipate to expand in the next decade, to increase above 20% at least, and somewhere towards 30% of the terrestrial area of the country, which is significant. At the same time, we have an increasing understanding of climate change and the role of protected areas in mitigating or helping us adapt to that climate change. We also understand that human well-being is very deeply dependent on intact ecosystems, and the role of these intact ecosystems and what is sometimes called ecological infrastructure is very clearly highlighted in the 2019 report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems. It's not a UN body, but it is an intergovernmental body. And then, of course, from the economist side, from business, the World Economic Forum rates biodiversity loss in the top 5 global risks. This is in itself very important to take note of. So much so that I've got the next slide for you, where if you look at this graph as a whole, the top right-hand corner are high impact, high likelihood risks. There, right in the top corner, you have biodiversity loss and climate action failure. If we don't address these, we're not addressing the most significant risks to humanity. Biodiversity loss, just to reiterate, is linked to increased food insecurity. It's increased human health risks, for example, COVID-19, and many of you will be aware of the discussions around zoonotic diseases. It's also linked to exacerbated climate change impact. Business see this as a significant risk to their operations. And of course, that translates down the line into increased loss of livelihoods and the impact on human health. So we have to start thinking in terms of this new buzzword that's out there, resilience. How do we buffer against these risks and build resilience into our society as we start thinking about financing protected areas going forward? I think it's also fair to say that although we understand, we have an increasing understanding of these risks of biodiversity loss and the importance of protected areas, we are really still trying to figure out how to finance them. And there's no doubt that tourism will play a role in it going forward, but we have to look at other options. Essentially, the problem is that biodiversity and economy remain externalized, and the costs of the biodiversity economy and development are externalized. They're not priced into what we do. So we don't have the necessary funding at our disposal to spend on these costs. It's not only the case for biodiversity, as I've said before, we've seen it for climate change. And I really want to emphasize here, healthy water and water systems. We allow way too much damage to happen to our water systems, and we are going to potentially suffer the consequences if we don't view this in the same light. So the COVID-19 pandemic, although we're beginning to understand the new situation, again, we're still trying to figure out the details. We know that there's been a dramatic collapse in long-haul travel, and with that, in the tourism industry as we know it. The state's capacity to fund protected areas as a result of the lockdowns and the impacts on global economies is likely to be reduced due to reduced tax earnings and the inevitable reallocation of resources. And it's not clear when things will return to normal, if they ever will. It's not clear what the new normal will be. So very quickly, what does resilience theory tell us? It says immediately following a shock, in the short term, we need to persist. We can't just give up. We've got to find ways of hanging in there, weathering the shock. In the medium, we have to figure out in what way we need to adapt. This is particularly if that the disturbance persists, or if what we're doing doesn't get us back to the new normal. In the longer term, however, we may need to transform things completely. And it's not clear at this stage whether post-COVID we're going to only have to adapt a little bit, or whether we're going to have to transform substantially. But many people who I speak to, our intuition is that we're going to need to transform. The old normal is not going to return nearly as strongly as it was in the past. And how do we do that transformation? We need to diversify, reduce our reliance on tourism. In other words, too many eggs in one basket. And we need to innovate and seek new finance mechanisms for state protected areas. In the short term, this means retaining key staff. Despite the financial crisis, we don't want to lose expertise and skills. We have enormous expertise and skill, but we don't want to lose it. We need to focus on cost efficiencies. There are inevitable inefficiencies, and we need to avoid conservation subsidizing tourism. We can definitely focus on strengthening domestic tourism. That would fit into many other national agendas, which would be a positive approach to take. We need to look at optimizing the return on investment from existing facilities as best we can. And we need to strengthen ecologically and societally sustainable utilization of natural resources, whether that's providing meat to neighbors, hunting in adjacent areas, or through wildlife sales. I think these are important considerations. And we also need to then strengthen mutually beneficial partnerships. We can look at partnering with private sector, with businesses adjacent to protected areas, and corporates through, for example, subsidies or tax breaks. In the medium to longer term, there are both international and national opportunities. Philanthropy is clearly an important place to look. Carbon funding, although this at the moment appears to have limited opportunity as protected areas are well managed and therefore the carbon gain that one can get out of them is not necessarily as high as in degraded land. We need to look at fundraising initiatives. For example, the current initiative, which has been launched internationally, called the Wildlife Ranger Challenge, specifically to raise funds to ensure that the salaries of rangers who are on the ground protecting biodiversity are paid, that these people don't lose their jobs because of the crisis. We're looking at debt for nature type initiatives, impact financing type initiatives, and the campaign for nature type initiatives, all of which are good ideas, but they haven't really been tested at the mill. They haven't. We can't say they work or they work under these conditions. More locally, there's quite a lot of talk about how offsets can contribute to a national fund, which then goes to funding national priorities for biodiversity. Payment for ecosystem services has, for more than a decade now, been some kind of consideration. It's limited opportunity, but again, if we're not going to put all our eggs in one basket, there may well be areas where it can work well, and we should use those opportunities. Institutional rationalization. We have 11 agencies in the country as well as provincial departments. Is this necessary for the function that we're performing? We can reduce institutional barriers. So if KZN Wildlife or Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism Agency, for example, are looking after really important biodiversity assets, why should funding allocated to sand parks not be shared with them? Why should institutional barriers prevent a more equitable distribution of financing? And I think also, really importantly, we need to position ourselves for 5 years' time, not to take the short view, but to take the long view. There are risks. If we do nothing and believe that everything will settle back to the old normal in 2 years' time, we may get a nasty surprise, so we shouldn't do that. If sustainable use is not ecologically driven, there are very real risks that it'll be vulnerable to abuse, it'll likely be unsustainable, and it will be exposed by social media in ways that I don't think would be good for brand South Africa. Global bans or strongly voiced aversions to certain forms of hunting would easily be a risk if we're not careful in the way we approach the whole issue. As with COVID-19 and what we hear in the US, if we ignore the science, I think we're doing ourselves a lot of disfavor. We need to engage in what we do know and put that to good use in guiding our decision making. If we don't, future generations are unlikely to thank us. So if I can give you four take-home messages. The first one is that the model we developed in the 1960s has served us well for the past 60 years, but we put too much into tourism as the magic bullet for paying for conservation. We do need now to diversify and to think about change and how we're going to do it in a more sustainable way for the next 50 years. We do know that the scientific voice is increasingly telling us to deal with climate change and biodiversity loss. So we shouldn't be cutting back on protected areas. We should be using this opportunity to find ways of expanding our conservation of biodiversity. We are in a time of change. And in change, it's better to be proactive and to make deliberate choices based on knowledge rather than to allow it happen chance. And lastly, as protected areas are key elements of our adaptation to climate change, let's diversify the way we fund them and get them going more strongly. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dave. And we will be sending on that presentation to members of Parliament. Before I get to our second speaker, I just want to remind members of Parliament that after this, you will be free to ask some questions to both speakers. So do start indicating to me if you'd like to do so. Our second speaker today is Colin Bell. Colin has an economics degree from Wits University, but instead of going into the world of finance, after completing his degree, he landed his first job as a safari guide in Botswana in 1977, as you do. In 1988, Colin co-founded Wilderness Safaris, which went on to become one of the most successful specialist safari companies in Africa. Over the decades, it grew to manage camps and lodges over 7 countries, employed more than 3,000 people, and managed millions of acres of prime wildlife reserves, many in partnerships with local communities. Colin was also instrumental in the successful reintroduction of both black and white rhino into the Okavango Delta. After Wilderness Safaris, Colin went on to co-found Great Plains Conservation and Natural Selection Safaris. He has also co-authored 2 books. Colin, over to you. Are you there, Colin?
Honourable members, welcome, and thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Dave, for that presentation. So one of the key things I've learned in my 40 years in the wildlife and tourism industry is that funding protected areas is indeed, as Dave said, is a very, very difficult task. And going down this road, you make many errors, but you have to adapt. And if you get the right recipes, it's extraordinary how protected areas can be funded through a whole lot of different mechanisms. And I want to go back to the very early 90s, where a very interesting study was done about the most extractive industries in Africa. And number 1 was mining. Mining, surprisingly, came out as the number 1 extractive industry of that time. And most surprisingly is that tourism came in second as the most extractive industry in the early 90s. And that was because park fees were very small. Oops, sorry, I should have taken it off. Park fees were very small. The tourism industry was largely a polluter. The wastewater wasn't treated properly. The amount of generator carbon into the atmosphere was just too high. And over the last 30 years, tourism has gone from being this extractive industry to being the prime funder of conservation. As Dave's talked about the South African situation, but if you go from north of our borders, tourism in many instances funds up to 100% of protected areas cost and management fees. So this tourism industry has morphed over the last 30 years in a positive way and moved away from the colonial type way of running parks where the state funds the facilities to now being funded through the use and the enjoyment of tourism. And as we've seen under Corona, we've got issues when we hit the bad times. And this is an unusual event. But normally in tourism, we have these cycles. So 8-9 years of good years, and then bang, we have 911. Or we have the economic crisis of 2008. And generally, we were able to weather these ups and downs. But with this Corona story, we do have a big issue to face. Now, will we have to face this in the future or not? So while it's pretty dire at the moment, the future, I believe, is actually going to be extraordinarily good. And what's happening right now is that if you take Africa and you look at that old map, which I'm sure you've all seen, where you take the whole of the US and you put it into Africa, you add in China, you add in Japan, you all add in Europe, you add in India, and there's still space left over. And yet with all the space in Africa, we only got 5% of the world's tourism. But that is going to change now because Corona is going to make sure that the mass destinations are going to go out of favor and the nature-based tourism is going to come in favor. And just yesterday, Virtuoso, which is an organization, a global organization representing a lot of the top travel agents around the world who are in the top 5% of the global spend, they voted South Africa as the #1 destination of choice for 2001. So 2021, for next year. So an extraordinary thing. So while we're sitting at the bottom end of Africa, because of our nature-based tourism and our potential to be in the open and the wild, we've got an extraordinary potential. And we've got to make sure whatever we do now, we grab that potential and we start harnessing it, because we've got to get back to having tourism as part of the solution. Because while we're dreaming up the new solutions, and yes, Dave is absolutely right, we do need new solutions. We have no other solutions right now besides tourism. And we've got a fantastic opportunity. And I need to remind each and every one of you that tourism today, pre-corona, puts food on the table of 1 in 7 South Africans. We employ about 1.5 million people directly and indirectly. And through their dependence and all the rest of it, around about 1 in 7 South Africans depends on tourism to put food on their table and send their kids to school. It's a remarkable statistics. But I would like to portray to you that I believe that we are underperforming versus our potential. I believe that ratio should be as high as 1 in 3 South Africans should be dependent on tourism to put food on their table. And I'll give you the Australian example. Last year, they hosted 9.4 million fly-in tourists. That's an extraordinary number when you put it against the South Africa's like for like, where South Africa only hosted about 2.5 million like for like fly-in tourists. When I say fly-in, anybody from Nigeria through to New Zealand and everybody in between. So I'm excluding the land-based arrivals like Lesotho and that, because it's a different type of tourism. So like for like, we weren't even anywhere near Australia's potential. And what has Australia got? They've got a rock, they've got a nice looking bridge, they've got a barrier reef which is dying, and they've got some good food. And Australia got 9.4 million tourist arrivals. Now, can you imagine if South Africa lived to its potential? We've got the most extraordinary wildlife, we've got the most incredible cultures, we've got friendly people, our services are fantastic, our systems work, we have great airlines, etc., etc. Well, hopefully they come back. And we're in a situation that our potential is to be a lot more than we are producing. We should be hosting well north of 2.5 million fly-in tourists. If we could get to even just 1 million more, even half of Australia, the amount that would translate into the fiscus and to foreign exchange reserves of South Africa would be many hundreds of billions of rand. I stress B. Many hundreds of billion rands would come into South Africa. Just the VAT and the taxes on that would be extraordinary. And I think that what we've got to do is that while we're working out the new way we go forward, we have to now develop our potential to the fullest. And we need those extra billions. And if we got the extra billions, like we should have had for the last 10, 15 years, we would have had extra money to put away for the rainy days. And you're probably wondering why I'm talking to you as the parliamentary portfolio for environment, fisheries, and forestry about tourism. Well, I believe that in South Africa, everybody has to do tourism. And the Australians pioneered this. The Australian government made sure that every single department fell behind tourism. And that way they were able to grow tourism. And I believe that every person in South Africa, every government department does tourism, even though it might be health or home affairs, or in particular, DEF. And I think that DEF is one of the most important. I think DEF, its policies or its lack of policies will have more positive or negative impacts than the Department of Tourism, because we are basically a nature-based tourism destination. And nature-based, if we get that right and we thrive on that and we develop the nature-based tourism industry here, we can do amazing things. And I think my great sadness of this corona period right now is that we should have opened up nature-based tourism earlier, because that creates revenue for our rural areas. It makes sure that our rural people have got jobs and their dependents have got food, and we can minimize the threats on our protected areas. But if we can get this tourism industry to thrive off the back of nature-based tourism, which is where the world will be going, I think that we've got an opportunity. But sadly, in my view, and please take this as being positive, I believe that whilst DEF is at the very heart and the foundation of our tourism industry, through a lot of DEF's policies and actions and inactions, I believe that South Africa doesn't reach its full potential. And I'm urging you as the portfolio committee for DEF to really think about some of our policies and help guide DEF to create policies which are good for South Africa Limited and brand South Africa in the big picture. And we need long-term solutions. We don't need short-term solutions which shoot us in the foot and damage us. So what do we think we need to change? Now, I'm saying this as I spent 3 years as a board member of South African Tourism, and I realized how little South African tourism can actually do to drive this process if the foundations are not good. And so for South African tourism to thrive, it's like going to a jazz concert. If you've got a 20-piece jazz musician set and 19 are brilliant, and you've got little Johnny on the trombone on the corner and he's out of sync with everybody else, it's a disaster. We need everybody to fire and be in the same direction. And my tragedy, my feeling right now is that this is not happening in South Africa. And I'd like to give you some examples. Right now, South Africa is one of the world's pariahs when it comes to the perception of what we do in the lion world. We have a captive lion breeding and canned lion hunting industry, which does nothing for conservation. It does incredible damage to brand South Africa. And yet we've got a handful of people, maybe less than 100, who are the beneficiaries of this despicable industry, which drags brand South Africa down. Why are we allowing can hunting and lion breeding to continue when it's bad for South Africa Inc.? And remember, the beneficiaries of these less than 100 people will never vote for the ANC. They are all pale males in their 60s and over who have got the cash. They've got ample opportunity. They are not helping brand South Africa. Take, for instance, rhino horn sales. Right now inside DEF, there's a movement to go and try and get our rhinos horn sales legalized. And yet the rest of the world understands, and remember, I'm an economist, that the trading and opening up of legalized trade in rhino horn is going to stimulate demand. And the more we stimulate demand, the more poaching there will be, because the criminal syndicates take these opportunities and they exploit them. So while the rest of the world is saying close down all trade in wildlife, especially in these zoonotic times, we are saying, no, we actually want to go and trade it. We're going to put more pressure on our parks and reserves through increased poaching, which will then potentially make South Africa a Big Four destination. And the last time I went to Kruger Park, we spent a week there, I did not see one rhino. So we're well on the way to being a Big Four destination. If we become a Big Four destination, not a Big Five destination, we will have less tourists arriving to come and experience our wildlife and our tourism industry. And if we have less tourism, we're going to have less money for conservation and for park management and protected areas. Same with ivory sales. We're now actively trying to promote ivory sales where the rest of the world is trying to shut it down. And remember, CITES and all the members of CITES are voting considerably against all trade in these iconic species. So hunting, Dave touched on hunting. And we must remember that hunting should only be happening if it's the economic use of the last resort. If we're in an area which is, say, adjoining Kruger Park, we know, and I can prove to you from past examples, that photographic tourism will generate 1,000 times more benefit in a prime area next to an unfenced national park than hunting will. But at the moment, the benefits go to some of the wealthiest South Africans just so that they don't have to pay their rates and tax and security. Why should South Africa, brand South Africa, and all the people around there be marginalized or have their potential limited through limited hunts which benefit a few but ignore the masses? So it's a thorny topic, and I stress that hunting should only happen as the economic use of the last resort. Shark finning. DEF has just allowed the longline shark fishing industry to thrive. There are 2 boats who are longlining off the southern Cape coasts, and they're decimating the lion population. They reckon there's only about 50 people employed, and the total revenue generated is about 15 million a year. And yet the shark viewing industry, the photographic industry around shark viewing was over R1 billion. And that's been decimated by over a half because we don't have sharks to view. So while we think we're creating jobs on the one hand for a few people, we are reducing the ability for the shark viewing industry to provide value for South Africa, to create jobs, and it's losing jobs at a far greater scale than the shark finning industry does. And we're not saying put them out of business. What we're saying is that take away their shark finning license and get them assimilated back to the fishing area where they still will have their jobs. But let the shark viewing industry thrive and grow to its potential. So these type of examples where we go short term without thinking of the big picture is where I'm concerned. And if we're all on the same page and we all get behind Brand South Africa and we grow tourism to South Africa as the prime source, then we've got the opportunity to think about the other forms of how we fund our protected areas. And so the private areas, which Dave touched on, they all get on remarkably well. Yes, Corona's hit them, but they all make a plan, and they make a plan to become sustainable through the prices they charge and through the services and the experiences they can offer, which is not available generally in national parks. They can go off-road, they can do all sorts of activities which you can't do in a national park. So the protected areas have a function and the private areas have a function to all build Brand South Africa. So how do we go and fund protected areas sustainably? Number one, we must grow tourism to its full potential. And by growing tourism to its full potential, we'll get more people employed, and particularly in our rural areas where we need the jobs to be created. And that's where the transformation will take place. The more we grow our arrivals by making South Africa the prime destination on the planet, the more opportunities for transformation to take place. The more the little guys can get in and they've got opportunities, and the township tours will develop and all the rest of it. So we've got to do that. And how we do that, DEF's got to get on side for Brand South Africa. And then, so we've got to get rid of the can hunting industry. We've got to get rid of the long lining industry. We've got no more dubious exports of those 5,000 animals which were exposed on the EMS report. I mean, that was dubious, and it affects Brand South Africa. We can't do these type of things because it's hammering South Africa's reputation overseas. We can't talk about rhino horn sales and ivory sales. Take that off the table. It's not going to happen. And the more we talk about it, the more it damages South Africa's reputation around the planet. So what do we need? We need a lot more tourism in the good times. And remember, if we've got hundreds of billions or more rounds, that'll help us subsidize the bad times. We need to work like Australia, where everything comes behind tourism. And then, while that's happening, and remember, next year could be a pivotal year for South Africa, we could get back quite quickly because what our nature-based tourism can offer. Then we must look at carbon credits. Yes, Dave's absolutely 100%. The carbon credits in protected areas are not that valuable. But remember, we're converting a lot of areas into protected areas, and there's massive value in carbon credits. We can go a whole lot of range of initiatives, and I don't think I've really got the time here, but I thought that's it. My message is, DEF, please, let's put our policies in line with what's good for Brand South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. So I'm going to allow questions now. I think the first one to put up a hand was the Honourable Winkler. Hannah, just remember to unmute your mic, please.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for that very informative presentation. Colin, I have the exact same sentiments about these things. I don't understand how South Africa is capable of sending this very mixed signaling. On the one hand, we want to promote conservation. We understand the incredible biodiversity loss that we're faced with. But then yet simultaneously, we are trying to propagate the killing of animals and the mass commercialization of animals. And there seems to be some sort of cognitive dissonance between these two approaches. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, because there is some legislation underway to actually sort of circumvent the protection that's afforded to, I would say, protected species. And that is, if they are mass commercially farmed, then we can, use them exploitatively, because that doesn't really fall into the gamut of like wildlife. It's domesticated wildlife. And that this is going to take pressure off of our wild populations. But obviously, I think that there there is a bit of, I think, misconception about that, because as you say, you are then, sending mixed signals to the market, and you're basically stimulating demand for these products, which then actually put pressure on the wildlife populations and not vice versa. So there is that amendment that is going through. And then also with regard to CITES, I know that there's appendix, A and B animals, or appendix, I think 1 and 2 animals, and certain animals we agree internationally, cannot be traded, and their parts cannot be traded. But if they are then commercially farmed, then their trade becomes legalized. So again, there's ways to circumvent protection of our wildlife, our iconic wildlife species internationally. And really how we can prevent this kind of very exploitative and consumptive use of our wildlife in the face of a huge biodiversity crisis and the 6th mass extinction. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I'd just like to point out one thing, that we've got load shedding in Hout Bay where I'm right now, and we're talking about climate change and all the rest of it. And I said to our facilitator, and I said, I probably can't be on the thing, but we've got solar panels here. So how's this? We're just operating as usual, no issue at all while load shedding goes on. So guys, what we end up doing by putting up solar and we start looking after the climate, we actually save money and it makes us more efficient. So just a little message on the side. Yeah, so very much so, Honourable Member, we've got mixed messages, and the mixed messages are downfall. And we need to look at the global population, and we need to say, how many people are very in favor of hunting and who is not? How many people are vehemently against hunting? And it's probably somewhere in the ratio of about 80% of the world are anti-hunting, probably 10% are vehemently pro-hunting, and then you get a bit of middle in the middle there. But whatever happens, the vast majority of our market is vehemently anti-hunting, and we've got to be so careful how we do the hunting. And as I say, if it's the economic use of the last resort, and it's done totally sustainably, and as Dave pointed out, we've got to have it really well controlled and policed, then you can minimize the damage. But when we are hunting within meters of the Kruger National Park boundary, and from animals coming out of Kruger Park, and we're killing the pride lions, and we're hunting these iconic elephants and all the rest of it, it sends a terrible signal to the world. So we've got to make a decision. What do we want? Do we want the betterment for all of South Africa, the vast majority, by appealing to the vast majority of the people overseas, and therefore boost our ability to attract tourists? Or do we want to keep shooting ourselves in the foot and then we still bumble along at 2.5 million fly-in tourists? My view is that we need to go to 4 million fly-in tourists. We need to be at least getting to half of what Australia does. And Australia doesn't shoot itself in the feet. We can't have this long lining. We can't do these things which are killing our reputation. So if we get rid of the mixed messages, we have a real chance to grow our tourism to our potential. And I keep coming back to this. I don't think there's a country in the world which has got the potential of South Africa. But we must utilize our culture, our people, our smiles, our service, the infrastructure, and all these things to really drive this home. And then it's going to happen. But now you mentioned this whole issue of commercial farming for rhinos and all the rest of it. Yes, there is a little sneaky way around CITES, but it's the offspring of commercially farmed animals. But basically, the Asian market much prefers wild animals to farmed animals, because it's always believed that wild animals like wild bears, wild tigers have more potency in whatever they need to use it. Like a lot of our canned lions, which end up in the carcasses being exported, go for wine. Now, if you've got wild tigers or wild lions in there, it's believed to have more potency. So while we think that we've been clever and we've got a sneaky way around the CITES regulations, remember you've got to have a buyer nation. And the buyer nation, China was thinking about buying rhino horn again. They banned all rhino horn consumption, traditional Chinese medicine, in January of 1994. So it's not been part of traditional Chinese medicines for decades. And they flirted with that quite recently. And within weeks, they shut it down because their reputation to China as a whole was so bad. So we're not going to get the Chinese to buy. We're not going to get many Asian countries to buy. The country which will buy will be North Korea. Do we want to go and trade with North Korea? Is it good for brand South Africa that we out there trading where we know that they're not the consumer? They're going to leak it illegally into other Asian markets. So yes, there's a loophole, but it's against what the feeling of the planet is. And we've got to take the planet's view, because the planet likes to buy our minerals. The planet likes to buy our diamonds. The planet likes to buy our tourism, whatever it is. We want to get into the tech business. We want to drive Africa's agenda. And we can't do it if a lot of the planet's saying, no, we don't want to touch you. We've got to put brand South Africa first. We've got to think about the vast majority of the people around the world who buy our products. And we've got to minimize the risk of doing damage to brand South Africa.
Can I check, Dave, did you want to come in on this?
Thanks, Melody. Yes, I just wanted to respond to the honourable member saying that, unlike Colin, I don't come from a tourism side. I come from a much more of a science-based side. And she's absolutely correct. You can understand animal populations that are being managed as ecologically intact, biodiversity-rich populations versus other forms of management. And really, a lot of what we should be advancing and what we should be advocating for is ecologically sound management of animals, not other forms, production-driven forms of animal management. It's way better for us in the long term.
Thank you. Honourable Paulson, you are next.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Dave and Colin, for your presentations. And I'd like to touch first and foremost on the private game reserves, and I think this is where the problem comes in, where those owners would want to, find a way of profiting out of the activity. So I think, and like you said, it's pale male owners, and I can assure you none of those pale male owners are supporters of the EFF. I think you must look there amongst the DA and the Freedom Front Plus. So I think the big problem is that we're allowing private game reserves to proliferate, and I think we should look at nationalizing game reserves, especially those ones in Waterberg and Makanyakude in the KZN, and that would take us a long way in being able to reduce the fact that these people farm these animals, these wild animals, lions, rhinos, for benefit other than for tourism. So the tourists, they come there just to shoot a lion and take it home and hang it up on the wall, or to actually use the other products of the Caucus for other purposes. So I think the fact is we're allowing private game reserves to proliferate. But I think also for us, from the party I represent, we'd want better participation by local communities and community forums in the management of protected areas. I think, and very little of that is being done at the moment. We're hoping that the current minister would move on that, because a lot of the people involved in poaching of animals are people who live around these game reserves, and it's a form of income for them. So if they're involved, if we allow those communities to be involved in the protection of those reserves, it would be less of an issue where we have them poaching those animals for income instead. I just wanted to know from Dave, the 17% of protected areas, and the fact that we have to increase by 140,000 square meters and square kilometers of land and 105,000 square kilometers of marine. Is this figure set globally? And are these unique ecosystems to South Africa, or do they exist elsewhere around the world? And the other question is, to what extent, and I haven't seen it on your slide, Dave, bioprospecting, because a lot of the species that we have are in demand out there. So to what extent has bioprospecting contributed to the funding of our protected areas? Obviously, we can constantly reproduce these species. So we can also, if these species, and I'm talking about plant species, can contribute to the well-being of others, obviously we have to make it available, but also what sort of benefit have we gotten in return? And Colin, you've mentioned that, and I know you said it's the fact that you mentioned that some of the EFF policies, environment, forestry and fisheries, the department, not the party, are not good for tourism. Now, I know you've mentioned the fact that we are slow in having a complete ban on canned lion hunting, that we are trying to promote the sale of rhino horn and also elephant tusks. So what else is there, that you feel that we should look at in terms of having policies that are going to be good for tourism? It's good to know what it is exactly where the department is failing, that we can actually have a look at it and work with people like yourself and Dave to improve tourism to these protected areas, and also to get those figures up from 2.5 million. Thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you. Just before the speakers come in, can I just ask, in the interest of time, both Dave and Colin, that you just keep it as brief as possible, because there's quite a few people who still want to ask questions. But there was a lovely field of array of questions there, but if you could just keep it as concise as possible. Thank you. Who wants to go first? Dave, do you want to go first?
I'll do so. Thanks, Melanie. Honourable Member, yes, I think those are very good questions, and thank you for them. The bioprospecting question, I think, is a very good one, and I don't have the numbers at my fingertips as to what the nature of revenue could be, what the size of that kitty would be. But I can certainly follow up and try and find that and get the information back to you via the relevant channels. And of course, I think that would be a really neat way of contributing to protected area financing. So thank you for that. In terms of the ecosystems that require protecting, we're talking absolutely unique ecosystems to South Africa that don't exist anywhere else in the world. So every country would have that same set of targets, which is currently 17% of the surface area in the terrestrial environment. And they would have to figure out which ecosystems in their country. So unfortunately, we can't outsource that responsibility to some other country. We have to take it on ourselves.
Colin, just unmute. Yeah.
Thank you, Honourable Minister, for those interesting questions. So let's start with the easy one.
Not yet. I'm not yet, Minister. We must wait till 2024.
Remember. Okay.
Working on it, though. Working on it, right?
Listen, if you behave yourself and you push through these policies, we'll bloody vote for you. So let's start with communities. Now, we agree 100% that communities have to be brought into the mainstream of the wildlife and tourism industry at scale, at the boardroom. The issue is the pace is actually quite slow. And I think this is where we need to focus as a country to make this happen a lot more. Now, we've got the processes underway. There's already been a couple of very successful parts of our wildlife areas and our protected areas who have been seeded across 2 communities under land claims, but the protected area remains intact, but the beneficiary is the communities. And this is the way the future has to be. And we've seen already in countries like Namibia. So Namibia is sitting with 40% of its countryside set aside for wildlife and conservation. But most of that, more than 50% of that, is now worked with communities, and they are now the prime beneficiary. And a lot of the wildlife areas in Namibia are community owned and controlled, and then they partner with the private sector, and they then are the prime beneficiary. So I think that South Africa has got a unique opportunity. We've got all these land claims in Kruger Park. I would love to see those land claims accelerated and awarded so that the communities around there have their chunk of Kruger Park where they're the prime beneficiary. And because they view the wildlife as an asset, they won't poach so much. And we're going to be on the winning formula. And you know what, how much a good news story that is? It'll go around the world. People love good news stories. And the overseas guests would travel to those concessions because they love to see people in rural areas being uplifted. So communities, absolutely, it's our big opportunity. And if there is an opportunity and the deaf has got any way to influence lands and all the rest of it, please make that happen. Because the more the community is involved, the less pressure there will be on the environment in the long term, because they get the benefits. They get the jobs, they get the training, they get cash, etc., etc. When it comes, just a quickie thing, going back to our tourism numbers, you quoted the 2.5 million. Remember, that's fly-in tourists. We have 10 million tourists in total, but most of those are land border arrivals. So we've got to compare like for like. So it's 2.5 million fly-in tourists. And I mention that because that's where the jobs are created. And it leads on to the final thing about the private reserves. Remember that these private reserves are charging a lot of money. They are what profile South Africa for, and the amount of money these reserves, like the Sabi Sand, I think the Sabi Sand's value to South Africa is far greater than the entire mining industry. And because the guests are paying a lot of money, they demand huge amount of services, and the jobs created are extraordinary. And what's recently happened, and it didn't happen in the 90s. In the 90s, when we were an extractive industry, there was very little feedback and flow of benefits into the communities and upliftment. Now it's changing. Those folks who are on the boundaries between the communities and wildlife understand that if they don't look after their communities outside, they're in trouble. So most of these lodges have schools and clinics and upliftment and feeding schemes, etc., etc. So I don't know if your thoughts of nationalization are going to create value. I think they will destroy value. And I think South Africa's sort of unique selling point is that we have a blend of everything. We have our national parks, we have our private game reserves, so we offer choice. And that's what tourists love. They love choice, so long as those private areas are really driving value. And I say driving value for Brand South Africa, it's jobs, it's skills training, it's upliftment. And remember, in those areas, there aren't any sort of decent hospitality schools. So it's on-the-job training. Those folks get fantastic training on the job at the highest rated facilities. These are some of the best rated hotels, and I'm using hotels in inverted commas, in the world. And to lose those would be crazy.
Thank you, Colin. Honorable Mbata, and then after that, just so that they know, will be Honorable Holomisa and then Honorable Singh. Honorable Mbata, you next.
Thank you, Melanie. My first question will be, is tourism part of this meeting? So that they can explain to us why there is a decrease during COVID-19, because I think they have a reason and so forth. The other one is that what are other departments involved in the funding of the protected areas? Because I know when we talk about Sun Park, there was a budget that was transferred from other areas of the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forest and Fisheries to Sun Park. And it was a huge amount of money. So we need to look at all departments that are funding the protected areas. And then when, I think it was the first speaker, and then when we talk about the healthy water that's being polluted by us, I think we also need to advise the department to say how best can we protect that water, because I know there was an issue to say when I was dealing with health promotion, to say by 2020 we will have less water because of how we are handling water. But how best can we do that? Because now it's 2020, and because we even touch the underground water and we pollute it. How best can you advise the department or us on doing that? And when it comes to the issue of the global ban hunting, there's those bans, the hunting bans that are needed, especially with the lion breeding. It's very important because it doesn't benefit anything to us as South Africans, to us as government. It's for specific individuals, and they are abusing the animals. So some of the bans are really in need to be done, especially the hunting one. I think with the climate change, we need to have a disaster management plan, because it's a natural thing. It's there, it comes, and it's going to be with us forever. So we must have a plan, but we need to advise each other also on how best can we do that. On the issue of the Department of Environmental Affairs creating policies, there's one thing I have realized. I was once in Japan, and Japan were surprised to say South African government has got good policies, but it's how we implement them. How we implement them is the problem. And again, if I compare to them and us, they have situational based policies in order to correct that situation. And I think we need to benchmark with other countries and try to utilize our policies, because we have policies, and the implementation, to me, it's a big problem. And then the other thing, I think the last one is that with the with animal poaching, we need to get to know who are the end users of those products. Where are they being sold? For what good reason? Then that's when we are going to resolve the problem. Because, okay, we can say community, yes, it's fine. I'm agreeing with that, because it's health promotion. It must be bottom-up approach, not top-down approach. And they are the first priority. But we need to have all stakeholders in that part of the community. Because I'm saying that once we know, because traditionally we have traditional things that we do. And some of those traditional things, if you go back, we used to use some of these animals products to heal others, to heal the community. So those are the things that we need to you need to do a stakeholder analysis so that we involve anyone. Then I'm telling you, by the end of the day, the animal poaching will be less. And once we know who is the end user, then we will be fine. Thank you.
Colin, a lot of questions there that I'm sure you want to come in on. Thank you, Honourable Mbata. Again, can I just ask the speakers to be as brief as possible? Colin, do you want to go first?
Honourable Mbata, I want to give you a big hug. And you hit on a whole lot of really important points. And the issue of us operating in silos is part of the reason why we have a problem. So we have the Department of Home Affairs, who puts ridiculous visa situations up there, and it impacts communities way down. They think they're doing good for South Africa by having unabridged child certificates. We lose an entire market of family tourism to this country. And it's because they're in a silo. And is tourism here? No, I think my plea to you is go and engage with tourism, the Department of Tourism, because we should all be together on this one. We all need to be behind the initiative to improve brand South Africa standing around the world to make this better. So the comment you mentioned climate change. So one of my big issues is that we always believe that the forests of the Amazon and the Congo basins, where a lot of the carbon is taken out of the atmosphere and stored for the better of humanity. But it's not only there, it's also in the soils. The soils are one of the biggest sequester of carbon out of the atmosphere. And if you go back to that map of Africa, we get all the different countries in there. We are taking a lot of the pollution from the first world and we're absorbing it in the soils of Africa. And I think there's a really strong case that Africa needs to be rewarded for protecting its national parks through what the carbon good we do for the planet. At the moment, there's no funds coming from the Northern Hemisphere polluters to Africa for doing that work for the planet. So I think there's a whole climate change argument which will help to fund protected areas around, not just in South Africa, but right the way through Africa. End users for a lot of the wildlife products is clearly driven by criminal syndicates. The criminal syndicates are normally in Vietnam, in Laos, and a little bit in China, and they feed into the large Asian market. And remember, these criminal syndicates are the best businessmen in the world. They understand products and they know how to drive markets, and they don't have one product. They've got heroin, they've got child trafficking, they've got prostitution, they've got drugs, they've got wildlife products, they've got all these different things, and they can withdraw them from the market to create higher prices, and they can flood the market when the price and the demand is right, and they create demand. So we know them. In fact, one of the people who bought some of our lion carcasses he's from Laos, and he's got a bounty on his head. His name is Kieversan. He's got a bounty on his head of $1 million. Somebody can go and take him to the US authorities, and they will earn $1 million. And that's been there since 2013. And yet South Africa went and sold some of the lion bones to Kieversan, a wanted international criminal. So it's, as you say, it's implementing our laws.
Dave, did you want to come in?
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, Honourable Mbata. I think really to get to the nub of your question, you asked a lot of technical questions, and this is really not the time to do it. But there are specialists who are working with the department around water issues. There are specialists working with the department on climate change. And it's I think it's really important to engage with them, but also to keep the pressure up, because as the department will be responsive to what they understand is politically important. So you're right, 15 years ago, we were really worried about acid mine drainage. I'm not sure to what extent that's been dealt with, but we need to ensure that it is properly dealt with, ensure that we get our water clean. Getting back to the protected area financing side of it, I think the engagement with communities around those parks is going to be a key element of how to bring in financing and to make that protected area socially acceptable and desirable. So I think of that, just keeping it very short, as Melanie's asked, hopefully that'll help.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think you meant it's not that it's not inappropriate to ask the technical questions. It's just difficult to answer them now, right? That's what you meant, right?
Absolutely. It takes time.
Yes.
It takes a lot of time.
Yes. Honorable Holomisa.
Thank you, Melanie, and good afternoon to my colleagues as well as to the presenters. The truth of the matter is that the Department of Environment should play its role, and that is to bring everybody who is involved or managing environment. So whether we are talking tourism, you're talking this and that, but the Department of Environmental Affairs is always central. What we need to look at, we may need to have a briefing from the relevant departments as to how far have they gone in terms of accommodating the communities around these parks, and also what are the effects of land claims And thirdly, we may have to, this Portfolio Committee of Environmental Affairs should also consider inviting the economic cluster with a view to make sure that they don't compete unnecessarily. But we must make sure that we speak from this, or sing from the same hymn. The issue of empowering the people around the parks, national parks, is a thorny issue which we need to prioritize. I know you can have conferences and this and that, and then after 2 weeks, people forget about it. The Department of Environmental Affairs, if I still remember, they gave power to, or delegated, or appointed an implementation agents for the green funds, and that was DBSA. It would be interesting as to how much have they invested to the communities around those parks, and also in the outlying areas. Sometimes you tend to think that the people who have got access to these funds are those who are running botanical gardens in the cities. Where is the money from we contribute every year to the GEF, that is Global Environmental Fund? Who is responsible to claim those funds and plow them back to the communities around the parks with a view to sustain the biodiversity, and that we make sure that we cascade those biodiversity programs to reach the disadvantaged areas. Lastly, if we were to talk about culling of animals, I foresee that if the communities were to be introduced into this sustainability of animals, wildlife, instead of culling those animals, we could perhaps donate them to the neighboring communities. Talk to the chiefs and the communities and say, we want this portion of the land to be part of you. We are going to remove the fence, which is a boundary between you and the national parks. Yet your employment and your livelihood depends on the national park. So we want to include you to be in part of that. And then that would need a little bit of training and funding. But man, we operate in silos in this country. It's frustrating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Holomisa. Dave, did you want to say something on that? Yeah. Dave, I think you're muted. Dave, can you just unmute? There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Honourable Member. A lot of questions in there and a lot of very good ones. Let me try and address what I can for you. Your question around the green funding and its contribution towards communities around protected areas, I can't immediately answer for you off the top of my head. But what I do know is that in 2010, a very detailed analysis of protected area funding was done for all protected areas in the country. And that took a lot of into consideration the engagement between the protected areas and surrounding communities. I think there's no protected area in the country nowadays that doesn't do this. But of course, those programs are also limited. So if the entire budget comes from the protected budget, it's difficult. I think we've been talking about getting out of the silos. If more of national departments had to contribute to that, recognizing their own roles, enormous value in that. And so I'll leave that with the committee to debate. Around the Global Environment Facility, there's an ongoing flow of funds back into the country for GEF supported projects, many of them linked to protected areas. At the moment, there's one with the World Bank, and it's all about promoting the biodiversity economy. So I don't think it's enough, but there certainly is activity there. There's some money also going into supporting anti-trafficking, and I think that's a key element. Whether that's engaging sufficiently with communities, I'm not sure, but there is some activity there. Maybe we need to promote that. Your comment about dropping fences between protected areas and community areas and allowing animals to expand their range, and potentially once they've expanded their range, to be sustainably utilized on that neighboring land, I think it's a very good one. It's been discussed many times. And in areas, I think, for example, of Hlahluwamfolozi Park in KwaZulu-Natal, there are 2 or 3 areas where that has happened. Hunting takes place on some, tourism takes place on others. Of course, it's limited by circumstance, but I don't think there's many people who would object to that. It would enable better ecological management of the wildlife. One of the real risks that we would need to be careful of in such an instance is, diseases move from animals to humans, as we know well from COVID. But the tuberculosis that exists in Kruger National Park at the moment in the buffalo population came from humans to cattle to the buffalo. So it moves both ways. And one would want to have ways of controlling disease effectively in those kind of circumstances. But great idea.
Colin?
Thank you, Honourable Holomisa. I just would like to push on a little bit about the land claims. And a lot of park and protected area officials are very concerned about communities. And they're nervous that they're going to lose and all the rest of it. And I think what we need to do is maybe show that the way Africa is going forward, the successes are when communities are really deeply involved. And if you take Rwanda, I met Diane Fossey in 1988, and she told me by the year 2000, there would be no mountain gorillas left on the planet. How wrong she was is because the Rwandan government brought communities directly into the thing. They charge $1,500 US for 1 hour with the gorillas, and half of that goes to communities. And the communities embrace the mountain gorillas as their own. And to the extent today that they've got too many mountain gorillas, they're going to have to make the parks bigger to accommodate the excesses. And in Namibia, where you've got communities who directly now view wildlife as their asset, wildlife has thrived as people have thrived. And there's areas on the other side when communities are excluded, like Sulu Game Reserve, the largest game reserve in Africa, which has now been divided in half because communities were excluded. So the very clear message is that when communities are included, we get real biodiversity happening for sustainable into the future. And when communities are excluded, we're going down the colonial route and there will be extinctions or there will be tears. And therefore, embrace land claims. Let's make it happen. Remember, the park controls the land claim facilities and what's going to be inside there. So you're not losing control.
Thank you, Colin. Honourable Singh, you're next, and then we're going to start. After that, we'll still allow Honourable Mchunu, and then we'll stop with the questions. Honourable Singh, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the presenters. I may just get cut off midway because of this load shedding problem. I've been hanging on my cell phone for some time, but thank you to all the presenters. I think when you come in almost at the end, a number of the buzzwords have been used and the kind of questions that I wanted to ask: sustainability, silos, communities. But one cannot, I was MEC for Environment in KwaZulu-Natal for a number of years, and one cannot overemphasize, as some of the speakers have and some of my colleagues have, the question of partnerships with communities. And, my view is that we are not doing enough to create sustainable partnerships between the private and the public sector, be it the public sector, the private sector that Honorable Paulson refers to, that drive around in fancy vehicles, etc., or be it just ordinary people that live around the parks. And my view, and I'd like the economist's view, and Dave, on the fact that I think DEF and Ezemvelo Wildlife and the Eastern Cape have a responsibility to preserve the biodiversity, to make sure that it's a saleable product, and let somebody else deal with the selling of that product. Now, with us, particularly with KZN Wildlife, who are in trouble at the moment, as Ezemvelo, and I'd like them to comment on that as well in terms of management. I mean, you want to do everything. You want to sell the rooms, you want to preserve the animals, preserve the integrity of those parks, and let somebody else do that, whether it's private sector, which is neighboring farmers, or whether it's community-based organizations. Why is it that in some of these areas next to government parks, I mean, they can charge 15,000 Rand a night and attract people, and yet we can't do it in our own government parks? Something is wrong somewhere. Best as a department, and that is to protect the areas, the biodiversity, the integrity of those areas, and let somebody else sell. Which brings me to the point of tourism. I mean, I think for the foreseeable future, international tourism is not going to be something that we can rely on. We have to find ways of seeing how we make our parks and our protected areas more accessible to local communities, create an experience for them, and make them affordable. At the moment, I mean, if you ask the people of Khayelitsha or those living in Hout Bay, how many of you have gone to Kirstenbosch Gardens and what have you benefited from there? You'll virtually get two answers from two people. But how many people have gone into our game parks? How many people have stayed in those camps? How many people have experienced what happens in those camps? We need to create opportunities for that to happen and focus more on domestic tourism and opportunities than on international tourism. I'll just stop there, Melanie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dave, shall I start with you again?
Thank you, Honourable Singh. Yes, I think, as you said, you came in possibly a little bit late, I'm not sure, but the need to ensure that the conservation financing goes towards protecting the resources is really, really important, particularly in this time where these resources are now being more and more stretched. But at the same time, where the tourism product can contribute to and support that, it needs to happen. I think there's some really good examples of that happening in the country, but there's no doubt we can improve on it in a range of areas as well. Whether we can ever function at the same level as the private sector, I think becomes more of a philosophical debate, because we're producing a product for the country, not only to finance conservation. So I think there are multiple agendas at play, and they have to be carefully weighed up. So I would be very hesitant to go into detail of commenting on the management in KZN Wildlife at the moment, because I haven't been there for a couple of years and it would be inappropriate. But I do think that KZN Wildlife has enormous opportunity to use its tourism leverage and to get the best return on investment and ensure that those funds flow into supporting conservation and don't provide a drain or a drag on conservation, which unfortunately in the past has happened. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Melanie.
Colin?
Honourable Singh, yeah, very, very pertinent points. So clearly domestic tourism is the bedrock of where you start. And the great tragedy is that South Africa really has not been able to motivate and get the largest portion of our population encouraged to go and visit our attractions. It's quite an indictment on us, and it's a big failure, and we have to work hard on that. I know when I was on the South African Tourism Board, money was allocated to particularly to go and develop the domestic market and try and get local people to travel into our sort of around the country. And remembering some of these provincial reserves are incredible value. I mean, they cost almost zero to go to these provincial reserves, and they're beautiful, they're magnificent, and they're just waiting. So yeah, but I do know South African tourism is working on it. It's one of their high priorities. I think part of the problem as well, they called it the program Shot Left, Now, talk about shooting ourselves in the foot. And overseas tourism says, then they pick up the same kind of advert and says, shot left. Why am I so going to get myself shot? So I think they're starting to rebrand that and get that thing right. But I mean, this is the part of the problem. We got some ponytail dude dreaming up these crazy slogans. It might be good for Tsotsitaal, but it doesn't develop tourism as it should. But it is a huge, huge failing. But I can guarantee it's right on the radar of South African tourism. And part of the problem with creating projects is that this government loves to just go off and do their own thing. And it's in tourism. So often there's campaigns, but they've never discussed with the tourism industry what will work. So the country's littered with all sorts of tourism programs here, there, and everywhere, but they never consulted with the people who are going to bring the tourists to the country. And, we've got TBCSA, which is an organization representing 15,000 tourism companies, but they hardly ever get consulted. And this is our problem. The government loves to go and do plans. And I think somebody mentioned it earlier that we're great at stories, but we're poor at implementation. But part of the plans, they have to be practical. And there's no point chucking a whole lot of millions into XYZ, and then you end up with a facility which has got no use for anybody. It's a nice little ribbon opening event, and then it just dies. So long as the private sector and government work together, and please, government, you've got to understand, the private sector is desperate to work with government. We all want a success in South Africa. So I plead with you, engage TBCSA. We'll find the best experts to come along. We'll work with you to create these projects which work. They won't be pie in the sky. But Honourable Singh, fantastic questions.
Honourable
So we are shooting ourselves on the foot.
Really wants to come in there. Jump in quickly, General, and then I'll jump in, Louise, General.
No, I'm saying I was just cracking a joke, saying shot left means we are shooting ourselves on the foot.
Honourable Mkhunu.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and greetings to all the colleagues and the presenters. Thank you for the presentation. I'll try to short because most of my questions have been taken. But I think what I want to say is what I'm gathering from the two presentations is that they are trying to say to us as members of parliament that we need to rethink and redirect the way we've been doing, in particular after the COVID-19 pandemic. And the study that they showed us about KZN Velo and the Eastern Cape one, for me, it just says that there is somewhere where, because of this situation, we are now having a serious financial problem in terms of funding of our protected areas, which we could have averted if we had done things in a different way. Now, my point is, now, when it comes to the rebuilding or reigniting our economy after the COVID-19, agreeing with Honorable Singh that we need to look more domestic economy. Is it possible for them to assist us to look at different avenues as they present them? In particular, as the portfolio committee of environment, forest and fisheries, that will really help us to work with the department and try and reignite the economy of our country, focusing on our domestic policies that are going to make sure that domestically we do support tourism in a way, but also the policies that are going to, whilst we're going to go back and work with other departments, that says tourism should form part of every development that we're doing. Yes, I know it's going to take some time, but we need to look at that as South African, because the reality now says that the COVID-19 has given us some lessons. Those lessons, we must take them up and find ways of working with the mistakes that we've done, the mistakes that happened before the COVID-19 that now needs to be taken up, and look at the value of whatever. I always believe that whenever there is a dark side, there's always a brighter side. So this is what we should be doing. But also, I'm interested in the transformation of the industry, that there is more of private that they were talking about. I know the captive lion breeding and the big operation and the shark viewing industry. But in terms of your analysis, or in terms of your studies, is it the implementation part, or is it a policy development that is going to help us to transform this industry so that we get more communities, or we take some back to the government, so that we can allow a lot of people to be able to participate in this kind of the industry. And I agree more with you when you talk about Brand South Africa. Can we then find a way of having some being able to develop something as the portfolio committee that is going to be up in promoting the Brand South Africa, so that we all agree with the different departments that what is it that we term Brand South Africa that we should really be prioritizing, so that we can rebuild our economy and reignite it for getting our communities involved in economic activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colin, I'm going to give you the first to go, and then Dave with the final words before I pass over to the chairperson of the committee for a few closing remarks. Colin?
Yeah, there were a lot of questions in there. So some policies are amazing. Some are appalling. So it's a case of working out what the good ones are. Like, for instance, the land claims in Kruger. The land claims which have happened, it's there. They just need to happen. Some policies are appallingly bad, and there needs to be a complete seismic change to rectify those policies, because it's not good for the greater South Africa. We have to really focus on getting communities involved, and the more communities are involved, the more transformation will happen. I think there's one thing which I would really change, for instance, in Sandparks, Kruger Park. At the moment, I think 1% of their revenues go towards communities. I would separate out, for instance, the cost for the accommodation and park entry, and then I would have a compulsory 10%, which is on top of that, which goes directly to a fund which is for communities. So it's a mixture. Some are policies good, some are policies appalling, and it's a case of stepping back. And you, as the portfolio committee, have got that power to help direct the government to get into the right spaces. And I think that the transformation will happen naturally when we've got communities involved, when we've got growth in tourism, the numbers are increasing, there's more cash in the system, and the government will be earning a hell of a lot more to make sure that they can stimulate transformation and make it happen even further. So it's a case of, we're on this kind of stuttering ship at the moment. We've got to get this ship up to full speed, and we have to have a direction which we all agree on, and we've got to make that happen at great speed. So it's a blend of everything.
Colin? Oh, sorry, David. Sorry.
Thank you, Melanie. So I'm going to take the opportunity, partly in response to the last honourable member's questions, but also just to sum up. I think going forward, there's no doubt tourism is going to be important in financing protected areas, but we need to strongly, clearly, and deliberately look for other opportunities and work towards developing them. So one of them, for example, is sustainable use, but there are many others. I think we need to continue breaking down silos. Many members have raised that issue. We break it down by partnering with communities, engaging with communities stronger, but also partnering with others, corporates, other countries, philanthropists. And then lastly, I think we need to really ensure that in all our decision-making around the biodiversity issues, we ensure that ecological science is underpinning it rather than other motivations. If we do that, we're on a ticket towards sustainability that is so much more solid than we might otherwise have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I want to hand over now on environment, forestry and fisheries, the Honourable Fikile Xhosa, and thereafter I'll close the meeting. Honourable Chair. Let's just make sure all the microphones are unmuted.
Mic on.
Melanie,
Yes, General.
the problem is that you guys in the big
Mic
centers,
off.
you neglected to upgrade the infrastructure of the then Transkei. You just dubbed it as, well, that was a homeland. It's not our priority. Look now, we can't access the chairperson.
You see? I know. It's like, yeah. But General, wasn't that your area? Could you not have done something for us?
Well, at that stage, we were using landline telecoms and so on, not cell phones and so on. I think I must organize a march, and I'll talk to the ANC comrades and say, let's march to the union buildings.
Yes, because in fact, it looks to me, can I just check? It looks to me that we've actually lost the chairperson, have we?
No, on a serious note, I think he didn't charge his battery earlier.
Okay, well, maybe he can't now. And now there's load shedding, so now he's not going to be able to do that. I think we've lost the chair, is that right?
Mic on.
Looks like
He's
it.
on all in terms of military language.
Yeah, the ANC is in control of ESCOM.
Well,
order comments.
if that's the case, then maybe we'll close with sadness, because I actually want to, in particularly, say a big thank you to the chair of the Portfolio Committee for facilitating these briefings. Without his support, of course, these can't happen. So thank you very, very much to him, and I'm sorry we lost him again this time. Thank you also to the speakers for coming on board and for giving us all their information and knowledge. Particularly thank you to the MPs as well. I think today was a particularly fantastic engagement, so thank you very much for the time. I think most of you are actually on recess, so thank you for spending your recess time with us in this briefing. We are hoping to follow up with another very special briefing soon in the upcoming weeks, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you also to everybody who joined us on YouTube. Until we see each other again, then stay safe and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Everybody, good luck.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.